In opposition to a proposed mining project in northern Penobscot County notched a major victory today. Brittany McHatton reports from the Land Use Planning Commission meeting in Brewer.
A Valentine's Day themed rally greeted attendees as they walked into the Land Use Planning Commission meeting in Brewer Wednesday morning. On the agenda, deciding the future of an application submitted by Wolfton Mount Chase LLC. The Canadian company hoping to rezone about 374 acres in the Katahdin region for the purpose of developing and operating a metallic mineral mine.
Metallic mining is one of the dirtiest industries on the planet. Now is the time to protect the clean water that we do have.
Commissioners first rejected a request by Wolfton to delay their final decision. The request came as Franklin County's new commissioner was not yet seated.
I think it made a lot of sense for there to be frankly, a very short delay.
Following that denial, commissioners heard final staff recommendations regarding Wolfton's zone change application for Pickett Mountain.
Staff found that the water resources around the area are of high quality and have a high public value that requires protection, and that the risk of long-term adverse impacts to water resources, including fisheries and aquatic habitats, is great.
All right, are we ready to vote? I think we are.
With that, commissioners rejected the proposal to the delight of the overwhelming majority of the standing room only crowd.
I'm pleased at the decision. I think this was the correct decision for the LUPC to make, and I think it's a step forward.
This area is incredibly important to, incredibly important to the Wabanaki people. There's been so much put into restoring the Penobscot River, and this would go completely the opposite way.
A representative from Wolfton says an appeal is an option, but he can't comment on exactly what they'll do next.
I am really still of the opinion that this is a very high value project that frankly should move forward. Which avenue is selected in order to do that or to attempt to do that, I'm not too sure.
Brittany McHatton, WABI TV5 News.